Hello my friends, my name is Rokas. This is my first video of this channel, be it like an introductory video to what we're doing here and what are actually primal martial arts. So my journey started from Aikido. I have been actually practicing it for 8 years and already earned a black belt in these 8 years. I'm very satisfied with the art itself and the philosophy it teaches and attitude towards the world and everybody around us. And I wanted to do something different. So the idea why I actually deviated from Aikido is that I am actually more interested in more primitive, more primal approaches to martial arts than are actually well established. So we already have some historical martial arts coming up, and HEMA is quite actually pronounced already, and it's a very good trend, I think, because in the East Asia we had these martial arts as if direct lineages from Middle Ages. So of course we understand that it's not exactly direct, but quite close to it, and so practices that have been continuous, though techniques change, but practices have been continued through long periods of time. We didn't have that much in Europe, so we have HEMA that actually tries to take that place and experiment as if merging experimental archaeology with martial art practices, and that's a very good thing. But this is also not the time I'm interested in. I'm more interested in I would say Stone Age, prehistory, and how people lived there. I wasn't directly interested in the fighting techniques of that age, but more actually primitive living, you know, all this survival, bushcraft, and all that stuff. But in a sense, all these martial techniques came along with it because there are some regions that are still being practiced, and they would have actually even more direct lineage than some Eastern or Asian techniques. And actually, we sometimes have quite a lot of material in museums about the weapons, because we have hand-to-hand combat. You don't have a lot of tools, so you don't have a lot of artifacts to find in the museums, except maybe some pictures or some drawings about that. But that would be also drawings of people that are doing that, and even maybe the person who was making the drawing didn't understand well, and maybe he was drawing, for example, the combats or some imaginary settings of the combat. But when we have weapons, we can actually sometimes there's only one or few ways to correctly use it if you take it into your hands. And you can take some stick in your hands, and well, there are several ways that are effective and several ways that are not. So for example, if you want to make some damage, of course you know that it's not enough to tap it with it or to slice with it. So you know that already these moves are not were not actually used because they didn't have any effect. But for example, moves that have a lot of power in it, so a lot of force, a lot of swing to it. And of course, if you want to have more power, you can add weight to it. So if there's a weight, so there's inertia, so you have to always keep more circular motions and so on. So this can be deduced from the weapons that were used. And in fact, we have a lot of weapons in various museum collections, and we can see that the spectrum of what they were using actually is even larger than we see throughout other history. Because, well, every culture had their own styles. They were more isolated, they did not influence each other that much, they had their own different style, and therefore, though of course, we can imagine that they had their own different techniques as well a bit. So it's a lot of, it's a terra incognita here. I don't actually find any well-established channels on YouTube that are working specifically for that, specifically for the combat before the sword fighting, before the Metal Age, before we could effectively use cutting and slicing especially, and therefore actually having some tools, or actually axes, clubs, spear, and also daggers, and all types of fighting clubs. And as you can see, sometimes that some weapons are spread out throughout the maps. So if you take boomerang, for example, or generally how it's called throwing stick, you can find them not only in the Australia, but actually in North America, in Egypt, in Europe. There are some findings of that. And therefore it means that there's some certain rules that different cultures, not knowing about each other, found and developed to the same and almost the same object. So therefore this means that the techniques which are most effective with that can be attributed to some primitive form of fighting. And that's what I'm interested in. So that's what primal martial arts are. So not only just techniques with a spear, techniques with a club, techniques with some daggers or stone daggers or stone axe, or generally some other fighting stick, but techniques that are derived from the primitive people and primitive tools that they use and can find. And what it also leads us into is tool making. So they're not associated with some steel forges that produce metal swords for fighting and for practicing. We're not associated with that because everyone was making their own weapon. So it's more intimate, it's more, it's more close to the heart, because each weapon is very different. If you look actually at the artifacts, they're very different, have different carvings and different personality to them. And when you spend that much time, especially producing that with a stone tool, it becomes part of your actually personality. So DIY is also part of primitive martial arts, together with some forms of wilderness awareness and bushcraft and some survival skills, because they also point to that. And more interesting is that in primal martial arts, there's not so much specialization as we see in other martial arts. So if we have medieval combats, so of course there were archers and there were halberdiers, there were spearmen and so on. So in this case, we have large-scale combat, so specialization was required. If we look at the primitive combat, the specialization was not that much. And therefore, another approach that I very like with the primal martial arts is that you have to develop a lot of different skills that then converge to your techniques. So you can use the skill, the same movement with the axe, with the same movement with the hand, and of course if some thrust, the same with the hand, or with a stick, or with a dagger, or with a spear. And of course, other thing is even for target practice, some motion is the same as actually if you got to throw something, you can throw the way. Of course, you can strike that way, so the body motion is the same. And it actually develops the spatial understanding, the spatial awareness of the surrounding, and also trying to employ all your terrain for your advantages. And another thing is worth to consider: when we deviate from traditional martial arts, especially Asian martial arts, or European martial arts, or even MMA fighting, they are more ritualized fights, so dueling in a sense, with various either tools or weapons or barehanded. There was dueling, of course, in the primitive ages, but also what we have interesting is that there were no laws against carrying weapons. Weapon was part of the hunter, part of the person. Therefore, there were no laws forbidding to carry that with you. Of course, there might be laws forbidding to entering with certain weapons to the certain sacred location and so on. But generally, you and your weapons were always with you. So hand-to-hand combat was not that often. Of course, takedowns and so on, weapon takeaways have happened, but they were not so widespread as fighting with the weapon. And actually, that's an interesting thing when we think about Aikido and how it is effective or not effective, and that discussion of it. Aikido draws its techniques from actually techniques together with or against the sword or the stick. And what we actually see, why, for example, someone would like to grab the hand and hold of it, because actually that person is trying to draw the sword. So when it's trying to draw the sword, someone wants to grab the hand and keep it. So therefore, I perform now some throw because the person wants to keep that hand. Or even I perform the throw with drawing the sword. So when you think about free techniques, techniques without a weapon, in today's sense, they might not work, because another person, if he is holding the sword, his hand is actually occupied. Because if you draw the sword, you have an advantage, but before you draw it, you are at a disadvantage. So there's very important timing. Now, when we think about using this simple technique without the weapon, now it's becomes actually sometimes even I wouldn't say word stupid, but actually ineffective to apply, because another person also has free hands. So now you are more on even level, and therefore all these punches and kicks and so on start to be more important than the weapon itself. Now, in the primitive setting, we can think of, actually, I wouldn't be fighting someone bare hand if I can have a stick or a club for that, because I have an advantage. Why wouldn't I use it? And if we look actually at the bones, we see that majority of the trauma that was done is actually with some blunt object. And this is the way to actually to fight. So either you stab someone with a spear, or actually you just smack someone with a club or some stick. So of course another person, knowing that, would also have something to carry with him, either a club or a stick or a spear, to defend against it. So actually defending the same weapon from the same weapon, as we see in dueling, wasn't that actually common, except the ritual fighting that we see, for example, in Gunistic fighting in the South Africa and so on. So this idea of matching armaments and opposing each other is actually very recent, when no one was allowed to fight. And if you look at back at the Japan, for example, so where Aikido comes from, majority of the martial arts stem from the Edo period, where they were not allowed to fight between themselves, so they had to do something instead of that. So of course they have some traditions, especially sword fighting has some traditions before that, but the forms that they were actually training were performed for the non-fighting situations to develop the skill in non-fighting requirement. But if you look actually how they're fighting, for example, in Africa, we have these, as I mentioned, Guni fighting. So they don't care about that. It's even if in dueling, the rule is the first who draws blood wins, and that's it. So it's completely different setting, completely different mindset of the duel. So imagine what is the mindset of actually the combat, the worst scenario. And another thing is to consider that dueling always trains you for one-on-one, very narrow-sighted approach, and that's actually a good thing for sport. But in practice, you have to think about the surrounding, and this is actually one good thing that we have from Aikido, that they always train to see the surrounding and to actually be always on the outside of the group, not in the middle, just fighting on one and the other side and so on. So always having someone between yourself and the opponent. And therefore, the same is true for primitive and primal war scenarios. Even if you take, for example, Celtic warriors and compared to Roman legions. So legions have very drilled structure, and just to advance and stab and advance and stab, and therefore they are very effective. And if you look at the Celtic warriors, which are not actually prehistoric, they have metal, so have metal age, but still we have the idea that the fighter is fighting with one and the other, helping their friends and so on, and when he's in trouble someone is helping. So more dynamics surrounding watching each other's back and so on. So this, of course, historically is not so effective if you fight against someone who is formed, who has good shielding, who has good weaponry, and generally is better equipped. But in the development of the mindset of a primitive people, and actually that's the idea I'm leaning to now, that by training some martial art, you're not just training to fight and apply it in the streets or some self-defense scenario. You're training your mind to think that way. That's why someone starts, I don't know, some Japanese martial arts, they become more interested in Japanese culture. Someone starts Chinese martial art, they're more interested in Chinese culture. Someone starts European martial arts and gets more interested in medieval ages. And someone starts Indian martial arts or Filipino martial arts, and they're interested in that region. Sadly, no one is either investigating nor trying to revive Australian martial arts. If there are, I beg you write something in the comments, because I think that's the culture we haven't tapped enough in. At least if we're interested in primal wilderness living, and of course primal fighting techniques. But what I see that actually, for example, we have a HAMA, which is historical African martial arts. So association, they're trying to join martial arts together to actually bring awareness and interest in the culture of that region. So developing your skills in primal martial arts brings your awareness of your primitive roots, this paleo living. So hopefully you understood something I wanted to say, and maybe I'll have another introductory video, which if I'm not happy with that, or maybe some other video as well. So I will be posting both the techniques that I actually find very I find useful in that scenario and how they can be applied, and of course videos from when we have better weather coming closer to the summer, so videos about more survival skills, or actually not even survival per se, but actually I would say wilderness living and environmental appreciation, and just being there and experiencing the environment. And of course in the comments you can share your ideas and your thoughts and your questions. Of course that would also guide me through that process, and as I see, we have a lot ground to cover here. So let's do it together.